Welcome to Q&C Presents Conversations with Creators. In each episode, I dive deep into the minds of filmmakers from every corner of the industry. Whether it's horror, drama, sci-fi, or comedy, we'll explore the creative journeys behind these films, the challenges faced, and the passions that drive these storytellers. So join me as I go behind the scenes and discover what it takes to bring visions to life. Hello and welcome back to Quills and Chills and my series Conversations with Creators. I'm your host, Rick Clifton, and today I'm super excited to be talking to a favorite filmmaker of mine who's made a name for himself in both horror and LGBTQ spaces, whether it's writing, producing, or acting. He has done it all, bringing a unique blend of camp, of heart, and scares. His latest film, There's a Zombie Outside, debuted with Popcorn Frights Film Festival, and I'm super excited to have him here today to talk about his journey, the craft of indie filmmaking. And with all of that said, I'm going to stop talking and say welcome to the show, Michael Varrati.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I am thrilled to be here to talk about this movie, but queer filmmaking and indie filmmaking in general, all things very near and dear to my heart. So thanks for having me.
Sweet. I love the film, and I immediately after I saw it, I was like, okay, I have to reach out. We have to talk. So you've been on my radar for a little while now. I think Unusual Attachments is when I think it was a short film that went out back in 2020. And that's when I was like, oh my God, I love this, because it was right in the beginning of the pandemic and you really used remote recording and did a really great job with it. So I loved it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we put that out in April of 2020, if I recall correctly. We were one of the first quarantine horror shorts. And that came about because I love different means of storytelling, and I'm always looking at different ways to present a story. But I also, as anybody who works with me can attest, I just tend to like to stay busy. And so the second we were all told to stay at home, I had a couple days with the best laid intentions of I'm going to read some books, I'm going to watch some stuff. I don't know, but I didn't get into the banana bread of it all. And then within a few days, I was like, all right, this is going to make me nuts. I need to write something or make something. And I got on a call with Andrew J. Sepperly, who I work with a lot. He works as a cinematographer and VFX artist on a lot of, and my June Gloom Productions co-founder, Brandon Kirby. And I was like, is there a way we can make something without ever leaving our houses? And I kind of pitched the idea of Unusual Attachment, utilizing Zoom, which was very new to all of us. And we kind of said, well, we don't know what we don't know, so let's try it. And we kind of developed a whole system of filmmaking utilizing that platform. And within a month and a half, we had the short finished. And I'm really still proud of that piece. So thank you.
I loved it. Like I said, I just thought it was super smart, because you're right, it did come out very early in the pandemic. And I just thought it was brilliant the way that you sort of embraced where we were at the time and the technology that we had, and just made queer art out of it. And I loved it. So. But tell us a little bit about yourself. I want to get to know you a little bit. How did you arrive at horror filmmaking in general and just the love of film? What's your journey?
I have always loved storytelling. So when I was a little kid, I used to write stories on notebook paper and just run it over and give it to my parents as if I had written something very great. And they were very polite, because I'm sure it wasn't, but they always encouraged me. But I think for a lot of folks who know me because of horror, they are always surprised to learn that early on, I was sort of a scaredy cat. I didn't want to engage with the genre as a little kid. It freaked me out. If the music would even get intense on television, I would run over and turn the TV off, because I didn't want to see whatever scary thing was happening. And so for a good chunk of my early life, I avoided the genre. And then we were living in rural Colorado, kind of at the end of the 80s into the early 90s. And I was looking at the TV Guide one morning, because that's how old I am. That's how we used to find things. And I remember seeing that a show called USA Up All Night was doing a double feature of a movie called Attack of the Killer Tomatoes and its sequel, Return of the Killer Tomatoes. And that title tickled me. I thought it was really funny. And so I was like, I have to watch whatever this is, because how can tomatoes be killer? And my mom, knowing that I had sort of an aversion to spooky and scary things, was sort of like, well, I don't know. But I kind of kept at her, like, I want to watch this. I want to watch this. I want to watch this. And she said, all right. And she made the deal that I could watch it, but she was going to watch it with me. And so we made a big bowl of popcorn. She fell asleep 10 minutes in, and I ended up watching both of those movies in their entirety. And then how USA used to do it is after the hosts would sign off, they would play the movies again. And so then I ended up watching the movies a second time that same night. And I always refer to that moment as sort of my baptism into the genre, because there was a fundamental switch that flipped while watching those, where I realized these are not the kind of movies that my friends are talking about at school. These are not the kind of movies that are playing at the multiplex up the street. And I became obsessed with the idea of this other movie. And even though I didn't realize it at the time, there was sort of an attachment to queerness there as well. But early on, I just liked the idea that these movies kind of felt forbidden. And for whatever reason, once I became glommed onto that idea, the things that used to scare me started to fascinate me. And I always clarify when I talk about it, of course, I know Attack of the Killer Tomatoes is a horror comedy, but it was a great entry point that led me to things like Evil Dead and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and an obsession with all of the movies that I now have spent my whole life studying and living and breathing. And so later, when I was in college and kind of thinking about how I could pursue a career as a creator and a writer, I started looking at these films in a different way, because I was fascinated by my early attachment to them, because they were on the outside, because they were somewhat othered by society. And I had that kind of like moment where I realized, oh, I like these movies because they're like me. They're different. They are not necessarily speaking to the experiences that my friends are having. And so that kind of led to my love affair with the intersection of queer identity and horror. And, here we are.
And you embraced it beautifully, Miranda. Let's talk about your latest. There's a Zombie Outside. Tell us a little bit about what the movie's about.
There's Zombie Outside, at its core, is about a man whose life is intertwined with the world of cult movies, something to which I can relate, of course. And he becomes obsessed with a particular film in his history that leads to complications in the here and now, where he starts having this blurred lines between fact and fiction, and he descends into madness when he stops having the ability to recognize fact from fiction.
I love it. What inspired the story? I mean, you said a little bit about that. It sounds like you write a little bit about what you know, but what was the inspiration behind the story?
Well, I've been quite lucky in my career to exist in sort of the horror space in various capacities for a while now. And one of the things that I'm really interested in when looking at horror or science fiction or any of the genres that have massive fandoms attached to them is that audiences with folks in these spaces have a tendency to kind of forever attach an individual to a role or a movie that they made, and it kind of compartmentalizes them forever. And in some cases, this is a good thing. There are many people, if you go to conventions, who, by being associated with a film that's iconic, it's kind of given them a new journey in life. It's given them an ability to travel and meet people, and they really embrace it. And other folks find it very daunting. We know many like actors who maybe made a horror movie in the 80s and spend a long time not wanting to talk about it or whatever. And I became sort of obsessed with this idea of our attachment to art, and then what happens when we allow the art we're attached to define us as people. And so that was sort of the impetus of the movies. What happens when your whole identity is tied up in a cheesy horror film? And what's that mean when you don't know who you are anymore? So that was sort of the base level of the idea. But then when you add upon it the idea of compartmentalization to the marginalized and queer experience for queer creators, for marginalized creators, when we're compartmentalized, we're even further compartmentalized, because it creates a space that we are pigeonholed in and can't always get out of. So there were like all of these layers of exploration that I wanted to do in this movie using that. And also, I had experienced, as someone who was trying to make queer horror movies, especially when I started, this sort of reticence on the part of horror festivals if your movie was too queer, and queer festivals if your movie was too horror, to kind of engage with the material. So all of that was the stew from which There's a Zombie Outside was born. It was the idea that, like, what happens when art defines you, and what happens when you make art that's undefinable. So I knew in making it, it was going to be sort of a big ask for the audience to go along with us, because it is a weird movie. Any of us who are doing press about it, we always describe it as a weird movie because it is, and we recognize that. But we also knew that for the people who attached to the concept, the people who get it, that's who we made it for. So.
Well, thank you. I would like to think you making it for me, so I appreciate it. But that you just mentioned something I think is a quote, which was my favorite quote from the film, and too queer for horror fans and too horror for queer fans. And I actually wrote that down because I really loved it. So it was one of the many things I really liked about the film.
Well, that particular quote is born out of true experience. In fact, if not born out of true experience, it might be verbatim something that had been discussed at one point regarding another project of ours. We had really been through the ringer with some of our short films when we were trying to craft this kind of intersection of queer identity and horror that wasn't palpable in the way that it wasn't always nice. It presented maybe sometimes a harsher depiction of queer existence or a darker depiction of queer existence. We found that if we would take those movies to queer festivals, a lot of times they didn't want to engage with the material because of the horror, and because queer festivals for the longest time had sort of a edict that they only really wanted things that were affirming or like represented queer joy. But the thing is as creators, we do experience queer joy. We do want affirmation. And those movies are important, and we need those movies. But we also have queer depression. We have queer listlessness. We have queer rage. And when I go to the movies, I want to see all of those things. And so when we were finding queer festivals pushing back because they didn't want the horror, we also were going to horror festivals who didn't yet really want to engage with queer. And so that kind of frustration bubbled under the surface. And at some point we could have easily given up, right? But instead, I think we just doubled down and just made more of this stuff. And we were like, you can't ignore us. We're just going to keep showing up. So.
Exactly. We're not going to go away. This conversation is not about me, but I have been through that with a queer horror short of mine, and it was very much the same experience. All the queer festivals, no one wants the horror because exactly what you said. There's this desire to show affirming and joyful and uplifting movies, and I totally get it, and I recognize the need for that, but I also feel like we're at a point in the queer experience now where we need more queer villains. So I'm all about queer villains, so bring them on. So I'm going to nerd out just a little bit, and I'm going to ask, I thought the film was absolutely, besides loving it, I just thought it looked absolutely beautiful, and I just want to know what you shot it with, and talk about the locations and the production of it a little bit. This is gorgeous.
Well, thank you. The camera work was done by the aforementioned Andrew J. Sepperly, who is an absolute visual wizard. He is very thoughtful when we put our films together to talk to me about sort of like what I was thinking when I wrote it, but also kind of what effect do I want to leave the audience with? What sort of emotion, what sort of lens, for lack of a better term, do I want them to look at this world through? And it's through him and his sort of vast understanding of the technology that he will say, okay, well, for this aspect, we want to do this, and this aspect, we want to do this. So it was shot digitally, but with so many lenses and so much thoughtful planning and the lighting. I'm so thrilled that you commented on how the film looks, because I think he, as an artist, did a wonderful job. And that's the great joy of being a filmmaker, is when you build a team, you find the people who understand your vision, but whose vision that you understand, and you want to share that collaborative experience with. And every time we make something together, I always feel like he gets what I put on the page, but he also takes what I've put on the page and makes it even more vibrant. And so when anybody remarks on the way the film looks, I'm very proud, and I'm also proud to shout him out because he did such exceptional work. As far as where the movie was shot, it was shot mostly in Southern California. There was one instance where we shot up in San Francisco very briefly, but most of the film was shot in and around the Los Angeles area at there's a gay bar that we shot at here in Montecito that's owned by a man named Marty Sokol, who I know from the Trauma era. The cabin in the movie is out in Northridge. The apartment that you see in the movie is in downtown Los Angeles. So we really kind of took advantage of LA and used it as a landscape because, it is a movie about movies. So it made sense to shoot it here.
Totally. I loved it. I realize this is probably a hard one, but what's your favorite moment in the film? And I don't know if I want to say mine because I don't know if it's a spoiler, but I quoted it or said it when I reached out to you. But so,
Well, I
but
think
yeah,
a lot of people would probably share the same moment that you do, and I quite like it too because it's when I know when I'm watching it with an audience if the audience is going to go along with me or not, and without spoilers, because once you've seen the movie, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's an abrupt shift that occurs that people are either on board or they're not, and I bring quite a bit of joy when I see the reaction to that. And even if they react negatively, if the reaction's big enough, it kind of feeds me in a specific way. I would say there are moments, when you make a film, especially independently, like you are with it the whole time. And so I've watched this movie so many times that there are moments in it that stand out to me that maybe upon a first viewing, no one would even notice, in particular line readings that I'm obsessed with. There's a moment in the beginning of the film or in the early part of the film where after the boys at the cabin have had sort of like a drunken night celebrating Adam's birthday, they're all headed to bed. And one of them, Zeke, played by William Lott, is passed out on the floor. And when they all go to bed, one of the others is like, hey, do you need help getting him up? And Francisco, who plays Lewis, says, oh, fuck no, we're going to leave him where he lays. And he says that line. Now, that line's not in the script. I don't even remember what was in the script, but I remember when Francisco said that, I was being behind the camera and thinking, I didn't write that, but whatever that is better. And I think it's funny. So then I was just like, whatever you said before, when we do the coverage, you need to say that again. And I love that line because he nailed it the exact same way every single time, even though it was sort of an ad lib of his own. And it makes me laugh. I don't know that it would make the audience laugh because they don't have the context for it, but there's just something special about it because for a director, when you have these moments where you see the actors taking the characters and making them their own, there's something really special about that. And that's a real great immediate example of that to me.
now I love that. That's fantastic. And I remember that moment too. It's a fun, great moment. So you've worked both in horror and queer film spaces, but you've also worked a little bit in some other spaces too. I'm just kind of curious what you've done holiday films. And I love
Yes.
that. I love that there's like this the difference or sort of the dichotomy of the two. What I don't know, and my question for you is, have you done a holiday horror film?
Well, yes, kind of. I was part of an international horror anthology called Deathcember, which was a holiday horror anthology produced out of Germany. And I wrote and directed the second segment of that feature film that was all about a woman who is trying to return a toy at Christmas because in the time that she's bought it, something better has come out that she wants to get her son, but she doesn't have the receipt. And then it devolves into some crazy department store violence. And that was born out of the fact that I have done a number of holiday rom-coms for networks like Lifetime and Netflix and Ion, etc. And a filmmaker friend of mine had been contacted to participate in Deathcember, and they were talking to her about other filmmakers she recommended. And she was like, well, you should talk to Michael Varrati because he does Christmas stuff all the time. And when they reached out to me, I said, look, I love this because I have sort of a dedicated filmography in the world of holiday films and a dedicated filmography in the world of horror, but they not very often, if ever, had gotten the chance to cross over. So with that project, I got to kind of bridge the worlds and sort of look at aspects of holiday films that I considered to be scary that I hadn't really seen yet because I love Silent Night, Deadly Night. I love Christmas Evil, but those movies did Killer Santa so well. I knew that wasn't a space I wanted to go in. I wanted to find something else. So I was really thrilled to do that. I'm really proud with the response to that. I got to go to Germany for screenings of that film. I have scripted several holiday horror features, but as of right now, they're just sort of in script form. We'll see if we ever get them made.
Well, I'm excited to check out Deathcember. It sounds fun as hell, so I'm totally in. I want to talk a little bit about characterization and creating characters and developing characters that resonate not only with audiences but also push the boundaries some. And I think you've definitely done that in your pantheon of work. So, what's your process for sort of developing these characters?
When I develop a character, I like to think of the character as not a proxy. I don't know if that's the word I want to use, but someone who is there to experience the story. One question I get asked relating back to the holiday films, people are kind of fascinated. How can you juggle between horror and holiday, which the holiday movies are often very nice and nothing bad really ever happens. Even sort of the drama is something that at the end of the day, these people would live through. It's just, a bummer at Christmas. How do you do that and then do a gory XYZ over here with the Living Dead or a slasher, etc.? And I don't really think of genre when I sit down to write a story. I think about the people who live in that world, because I think it's really crucial when writing a character is that a character doesn't know what kind of movie they're in. They just know what their lived experience is. And I say, when you get up on Christmas morning to go to grandma's house, you could get in the car and make it and have a nice Christmas dinner, or your car could break down and you have to use the phone at a castle that you passed a few miles back. And those are two different movies that start exactly the same way with the same people. And so when I craft a story, I think about the characters. Who's the character? In the case of There's a Zombie Outside, this is a creator who feels stifled because he hasn't reached his potential. That's something that I could sit and think about and develop. In Unusual Attachment, since you brought it up, it's just a guy who's horny and he goes onto a chat roulette kind of site and wants to meet somebody, but he also talks to his friend who thinks that's a bad idea, and you kind of get their varying points of view. So I just think about the people who populate the world and what their reactions would be to the circumstances that they're thrown in. So for me, it's sort of idea first. Like, wouldn't it be funny if, a zombie was outside? All right, who's inside the house? What's their experience? And then I go from there.
I love that. It's fantastic. How do you see the landscape of queer horror sort of evolving? And we touched on this a little bit before, but what stories or themes are you hoping that we see more of in the future? For me, like I said, I want to see more villains. I want more bad guys. I feel like we're there.
Think the great thing about queer horror is that it's still in many ways finding its place, right? If you look at the last 5 years, we have more queer content in the horror space than ever. And we're getting so many indie creators breaking through with their movies, getting attention, and in ways that I think any of us who grew up hoping for a morsel of queer content in these movies would be thrilled by. Because the truth is that when I was a kid, it was subtextual, if at all. Very rarely would there be overt queerness in a horror movie. And if there was, it was always depicted in a negative light. But I think as the market opens and more creators step forward, we're going to see all sorts of stories and all sorts of voices. And my hope is that it just continues to expand, because for as many strides as we have taken in the last decade, and for as many people who are now seeing themselves in cinema, there are aspects and members of our community who have not been represented yet, who are waiting to see themselves. And so I'm just hoping that production companies are thinking about this and willing to give space to creators who are wanting to tell those stories, or adversely, as so many indie filmmakers do, the filmmakers who aren't seeing themselves get mobilized enough to go out and make the thing that they want to see.
I love that. I want to talk a little bit about just being mindful of the time so we can get you onto your next film festival. But I want to talk a little bit about indie filmmaking itself. What do you think are I think in indie filmmaking, maybe the better question here is resourcefulness is key, right? And is there a moment when a creative solution for you, especially in making this movie, whether it was budget, whether it was location, talent, whatever, ended up actually enhancing the final film in a very unexpected way?
Yeah, I think the truth is that when you don't have endless resources, you have to be endlessly creative. And that's something that I find really interesting when I go talk to film students, for example. I remember distinctly, I was up at a college in Sacramento talking to them about indie filmmaking, and a student was like, well, I have a script that I can't make for less than $5 million. What do I do? And I was like, well, you make it anyway. You make it anyway, whether you have $500, $5 million, $5,000. Find a way to take that story and make it. And always the hope is if you make it well, someone will give you more money for the next one. But I think what's so interesting is we have put up creative blinders in this way that people assume that if you don't have X amount of resources, you just can't do it. But when I think of the movies that changed the landscape, George Romero, for example, going down the zombie route, had very, very little money. They made, there's a Night of the Living Dead with, bubblegum wrapper and a couple bucks. And that movie became a culture defining film. So many filmmakers who don't have the resources had to think of creative fixes. George Lucas, when he made the original Star Wars, didn't have the budget that he wanted. So he found ways around things. And so that's it. It's, if you think that money is your solution, you're not really thinking creatively. You're thinking like a money person, and money people don't make the movies, creatives do. And that's just really, at the end of the day, if you have the want and the desire to make something, you'll find a way to make it. When I think of There's a Zombie Outside, to your point, I'm really in love with the creature design that Sig Neutron did for our zombies. Sig Neutron from Face Off. Sig is a brilliant creature effects artist. But that prosthetic was not an easy or cheap thing to do. And it took hours to put on, and we only had a limited shoot date. So what we did with the movie is we got kind of a bulk of our zombie stuff early. But because of the way the zombie appears in the movie through movie means, through like static televisions and things, we were able to actually include the zombie in more spaces in the film than we initially thought we were going to be able to based on the time of shooting. Because once we had Danny in the zombie makeup, we were like, okay, well, let's get a bunch of extra footage in different ways and make this work for these other aspects of the movie. Whereas if we had like a massive $1 million budget, we would have just kept paying to put him into the zombie suit, and he would have just kept having to do multiple hours upon hours of makeup. And I think either way, it would have worked, but our way at the end of the day ended up speaking to how the zombie works in the movie, and it works better.
Great. Then looking ahead, what themes or what stories are you excited to explore in your career as you and your future projects?
I really love just exploring different aspects of the queer experience. I think that we, as we discussed earlier, we have a great base of queer films that speak to different aspects of queer joy and queer affirmation, and we keep needing those, and those movies should still be made, and those movies are really important for the queer audience. But I'm also thrilled to explore the aspects of queer filmmaking that we don't get to see as much, and that wider representation and wider inclusivity will allow us to have the queer villains, to have the queer rage and the queer listlessness. I like the idea of telling stories about queer people who aren't necessarily good people, but their badness has nothing to do with them being queer and just everything to do with them being bad. And that to me is interesting. I always think about this sort of baseline writing school thought that you shouldn't make movies about likable people, and I don't think that's true. I think you can tell a story about an unlikable person, but you have to justify why we're following their story. I think that there are plenty of movies about people who are assholes, but I mean, Mad Max is not a good person.
Exactly.
But we're interested in following him. And so that to me is all about the framing. And I want that queer experience. I want the anti-hero for queer audiences. Give us the queer Mad Max, whether that's me or somebody else. Let's go. Let's expand our horizons.
So what's next for you, Michael? What are you working on that you can share with us? Is there anything exciting coming up?
Well, I just finished writing and directing the 2024 Fangoria Chainsaw Awards. This is my...
I saw that. I'm so excited. I can't wait for it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, this is my third year involved with the Chainsaw Awards, my third year writing, my second year directing. And we are going to be debuting the awards in October on Shudder. And I can't give too many more details at current time, but I'm really happy with it. It's always a joy to play in Fangoria's sandbox and get to work with the horror creators that they pull in. I'm also about to embark on the filming of a documentary project, which is going to be very long in the making, so I can talk about it now, but who knows when you'll see it. And then I just have some schemes for the next narrative feature, and hopefully that's sooner rather than later.
That's awesome. That's great. So, Michael, how can our audience find you on social media?
You can find me at Michael Varrati on both X and Instagram. It's just my name. Also, I do co-host a cult cinema podcast called Midnight Mass with my dear friend Peaches Christ, which comes out every other Wednesday at
Which
midnight.
I love, by the way.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, Peaches and I are quite frequently talking about the movies that shaped us and gave us a wider appreciation and love of horror and the cult pantheon. So if you want to know sort of about what makes me tick in terms of filmmaking and my love of cinema, that's a great place to keep up.
Well, that is absolutely fantastic. The movie is called There's a Zombie Outside. It's available now. Michael, how can our audience find it?
Well, it's currently rolling out at film festivals. As you mentioned, as soon as we're done here, I am about to head off to Portland to the Queer Screams Festival, although I think that will be in the past by the time your listeners check this out. We have festivals coming up in San Diego and London and Palm Springs, as well as hopefully other spots around the globe. And then my hope is to have it out on streaming before the end of the year, but announcement pending.
All right, perfect. I'll include links to social and to how I watched the movie and all of that stuff in the show notes, and I'll put it on the video as well. So
great, thank you.
Michael, thank you so much for taking the time this morning. I know you're on your way out, so I appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to me. And I just absolutely love the film, and I love your work, and I love what you're doing, and I'm a big fan, so I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your kind words and your support, and for having me on. This was great.
Got it. All right, guys, that's it. Thank you for joining, and we'll see you guys next time on Conversations.